Some losses never heal, they just learn to stay quiet. For 20 years, Tarrin Glade lived alone in the mountains, asking nothing from anyone and expecting even less. Then a postcard arrived, announcing an auction for an abandoned storage unit. The name on the lease belonged to someone she thought was gone forever. She gathered every dollar she had and walked down from the hills with her life packed into a canvas satchel. At the auction, she laid her money on the table and said, "It's all I've got." The rusted container had been sealed for 2 decades. When she finally pried it open, what she found inside changed everything she believed about the past. What truth had been locked away all those years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Tarrin Glade received the postcard, she had been splitting firewood behind her cabin, the same way she'd done every autumn for the past 2 decades. The air at 8,000 feet carried a sharpness that October, the kind that reminded you winter didn't ask permission before it arrived. She worked in silence, the only sounds the clean crack of the maul against pine and the occasional cry of a hawk circling above the ridge. Her cabin sat in a clearing she'd carved from the forest herself, a single room with a wood stove, a narrow bed, and shelves she'd built from salvaged lumber. No electricity, no running water, except what she hauled from the creek in 5-gallon buckets. The nearest road was a 4-mile hike down a trail only she used anymore. It was the kind of solitude most people couldn't tolerate for a weekend. Tarrin had made it her life. She was 58 now, her hands scarred and capable, her hair gone mostly grey and kept short for practicality. The mountains had weathered her the way they weathered everything, stripping away what was soft, leaving behind what could endure. She'd learned to read the sky, to know which plants would sustain her through lean months, to move through the forest without disturbing it. She asked nothing of the world below, and believed, until that postcard arrived, that the world had forgotten about her entirely. The general store in Pinecrest was her only connection to what people called civilization. Once a month, she made the journey down, trading preserves and hand-carved spoons for flour, salt, kerosene, whatever she couldn't make or grow herself. The storekeeper, a man named Gordon who'd run the place for 40 years, kept a box behind the counter for her mail. There was rarely anything in it, a seed catalogue now and then, a notice from the Forestry Service. That day in early October, Gordon had looked at her differently when she walked in. Not with pity exactly, but with the kind of careful attention people give when they know something you don't yet. "Got something for you, Tarrin," he'd said, reaching under the counter. "Been forwarded a few times by the look of it." The postcard was bent at one corner, the ink slightly smeared from handling. It advertised an estate auction in Ridgeline, a town she hadn't set foot in since the year 2005. The message was printed, impersonal, abandoned storage unit, contents to be auctioned. Original lessee, James Cooper, her hands had gone still holding it. Gordon pretended to arrange canned goods on a shelf, giving her privacy the way mountain people did. James Cooper. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 20 years. Tarrin stood in the store, holding the postcard, and for a moment she was 38 again, standing in a different store in Ridgeline, asking everyone who came through if they'd seen him, if anyone knew where he'd gone. The search had consumed her for 2 years. Posters, phone calls to hospitals and shelters, conversations with sheriff's deputies who grew less interested with each passing month. People vanish sometimes, they'd told her. Especially men. Especially when they had reasons to disappear. But James hadn't had reasons. That was what she'd tried to make them understand. They had met in Ridgeline, back when she'd been working as a bookkeeper for the county water district. James had come in to file some reports. He was a safety inspector for mining operations, traveling between sites across 3 states. He'd been quiet, methodical, the kind of man who read the fine print and asked thoughtful questions. They'd started talking over coffee, then over dinners that stretched late into the evening. Within a year, they were living together in a small rental house on the edge of town. It hadn't been a loud love. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations. It was the kind of love that showed itself in the way he'd warm her truck on cold mornings before she left for work, or how she'd leave notes in his lunch when he traveled for inspections. They'd talked about buying land together, maybe building something of their own. They'd talked about the future as if it were a sure thing. Then one March morning, he'd kissed her goodbye, said he'd be back in 3 days, and drove off in his truck to check on a site up north. 3 days became a week. A week became a month. His truck was found abandoned at a trailhead near an old mining town called Blackridge. No note, no signs of foul play. Just gone. The official conclusion had been that he'd likely had an accident hiking, that his body was somewhere in the wilderness where it might never be found. But Tarrin had never believed that. James was too careful, too experienced in rough country. And he'd been acting strange in the weeks before he left. Distracted, tense, making phone calls late at night that he'd end abruptly when she walked into the room. She'd waited 2 years in Ridgeline, certain he'd come back, certain there was an explanation. When the waiting became unbearable, when the sympathetic looks from neighbors started to feel like accusations of delusion, she'd packed what mattered into a backpack and walked into the mountains. She told herself it was temporary, just until she could think clearly again. 20 years was a long time to think. Now, standing in Gordon's store with the postcard in her hands, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 decades, a pull toward an answer. She'd spent that night in her cabin, unable to sleep, staring at the postcard by candlelight. A storage unit. James had never mentioned renting one. They'd lived simply, neither of them accumulating much. What could he have stored away that she didn't know about? The auction was scheduled for the following Saturday. 4 days away. She'd counted her money the next morning, $340 in bills she kept in a coffee tin, saved from her monthly trades. Not much, but it was everything she had. She'd added to it what she could: 2 jars of honey, her best carving knife, a wool blanket she'd woven herself. Then she'd packed her canvas satchel with a change of clothes, her water bottle and the postcard, and started walking down the mountain. The trail to Pinecrest took 6 hours at a steady pace. From there, she'd caught a ride with a logging truck driver heading east, then another with a woman driving to visit her daughter. By nightfall, she was standing at the edge of Ridgeline, looking at a town that felt both familiar and foreign. The diner where she and James used to eat breakfast was still there, though it had a different name now. The hardware store had closed. There was a new coffee shop with sidewalk tables and painted murals. Tarrin walked through it all like a ghost, unrecognized by the few people still out on the streets. She found a motel on the outskirts, the kind of place that rented by the week to construction workers and traveling salesmen. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, took her cash without questions. The room smelled of bleach and old carpet. Tarrin sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the telephone bolted to the nightstand, thinking about all the calls she'd made from rooms like this 20 years ago, calling anyone who might know where James had gone. She didn't sleep that night either. The auction yard was a gravel lot behind a storage facility on the north side of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence. When Tarrin arrived Saturday morning, there were already a dozen people milling around, dealers mostly, looking for furniture or tools they could resell. An auctioneer stood on a small platform, consulting a clipboard. The storage units were lined up in rows, each with a rolling door. Numbers were spray-painted on the concrete: 23, 24, 25. James's unit was number 27. According to the postcard, Tarrin stood apart from the crowd, a satchel across her shoulder, feeling the weight of everything she'd brought. The honey jars clinked softly when she moved. The auctioneer was a lean man in his 60s, wearing a bolo tie and speaking in the rapid, rhythmic patter of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He started with Unit 23, a collection of old furniture and boxes that went for $80 to a dealer in the front row. Unit 24 held sporting equipment and went for $50. The crowd thinned slightly as people realized there weren't any treasures to be found. When the auctioneer reached Unit 27, Tarrin's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. "All right, folks, this one's been sealed since 2005, the auctioneer said, checking his notes. Original renter stopped making payments, couldn't be located. You're bidding on the contents as is, unseen. We'll open it after purchase. Who'll start me at $50? No one moved. Tarrin forced herself to step forward. 50, she said, her voice rough from disuse. The auctioneer nodded. 50, I've got 50. Do I hear 60? Silence. People glanced at each other, then at Tarrin, then back at the unit. No one wanted to bid against someone who looked like they'd walked out of the wilderness. Going once at 50, the auctioneer said. Twice, 55, a voice called from the back. A dealer in a stained jacket, probably hoping to flip whatever was inside. Tarrin felt panic flutter in her chest. She reached into her satchel and pulled out one of the honey jars. I've got 60, she said, holding up the jar. And this! Local honey worth another 20 at any store. The auctioneer paused, looking uncertain. Ma'am, this is a cash auction. It's all I've got, Tarrin said, meeting his eyes. Her voice was steady now, calm. The money and the trade. That's my offer. Something in her tone made the dealer in the back step down. Maybe he recognized desperation, or maybe he just didn't care enough to push. The auctioneer looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sold to the lady with the honey, he said, his voice softer. Unit 27. Tarrin paid at a folding table, laying out her bills and the 2 jars of honey. The auctioneer's assistant counted the money twice, then wrote her a receipt. They handed her a key and a pair of bolt cutters for the lock. She walked to Unit 27 alone. The others had moved on to the next auction, their voices fading across the gravel lot. The metal door was streaked with rust, the lock corroded from 2 decades of weather. Tarrin fitted the cutters to the shackle and squeezed until it snapped. The lock fell away. She gripped the door handle and pulled upward. The door resisted, then gave with a metallic shriek, rolling up and revealing the dim interior. The smell hit her first, dust, old cardboard, the faint scent of James's cologne that she'd thought she'd forgotten. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness. Inside were boxes, furniture draped with sheets, a standing lamp, a filing cabinet, the ordinary remnants of a life. And there, on top of a cardboard box near the front, was a leather-bound ledger with James's name embossed on the cover. Tarrin stood at the threshold, her chest tight, knowing that whatever she found inside this container would change her understanding of everything that came before. She stepped inside and picked up the ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. She opened it to the first page and saw James's neat handwriting, dates, locations, numbers arranged in careful columns. A record of something he'd never shared with her. The truth, she realized, had been waiting here all along. Sealed away, but not lost. Not yet. Tarrin spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon moving through the storage unit like an archaeologist at a dig site. Careful and methodical. She'd rented a hand truck from the facility office and begun transferring boxes to her motel room, making 3 trips across town before the autumn sun dropped behind the mountains. The ledger had gone with her on the first trip, tucked safely in her satchel. She'd wanted to read it immediately, but something held her back, a sense that once she started, there would be no returning to the careful neutrality she'd maintained for 20 years. By evening, the motel room was transformed into a catalogue of James's hidden life. Boxes lined the walls, each labelled in his precise handwriting. Records 2003, 2004, reference materials, personal. The furniture remained in the unit. A desk, 2 chairs, a bookshelf, too large to move without help. Tarrin sat on the edge of the bed and finally opened the ledger. The entries began in January of 2003, 2 years before James disappeared. Each page was divided into columns, dates, locations, names, and notes. She recognized some of the locations, mining sites James had inspected as part of his work. But the notes were cryptic, referring to violations observed, unreported incidents, false certifications. She turned pages slowly, seeing a pattern emerge. James hadn't just been inspecting mines. He'd been documenting a systematic failure of safety protocols, a pattern of negligence that spanned multiple sites and years. The notes grew more detailed, more urgent. By late 2004, he was writing things like 3 incidents this month alone, all. covered up, and management threatened crew chief, who filed complaint. The final entry was dated March 10th, 2005, 5 days before he disappeared. Meeting R tomorrow at Blackridge. He has the proof we need. After this, we go to the state board, maybe federal if they won't act. I know this is dangerous, but I can't keep silent anymore. Too many men have died. Tarrin read the words 3 times, her hands trembling. James hadn't vanished by accident. He'd been killed. She'd known it instinctively 20 years ago, but seeing it confirmed in his own handwriting made it real in a way that hollowed her out. She set the ledger aside and reached for the box labeled Personal. Inside were clothes folded neatly, a pair of work boots, a coffee mug she remembered buying him for his birthday. Beneath those, wrapped in a pillowcase, was a metal lockbox about the size of a shoebox. The box was secured with a combination lock. Tarrin tried his birthday, her birthday, the date they'd met. Nothing worked. She sat staring at it, frustrated. Then noticed something she'd missed, a strip of masking tape on the bottom with 4 numbers written in pencil. 1847. The lock clicked open. Inside was a thick manila envelope, a cassette tape in a plastic case, and a photograph. Tarrin picked up the photograph first. It showed James standing with 3 other men in front of an industrial building she didn't recognize. The men wore work clothes, hard hats tucked under their arms. James looked younger in the photo, his hair darker, his face unlined. He was smiling, but his eyes held something guarded. She turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Blackridge, June 1998, Vincent, Marcus, James, Leo. June 1998, 7 years before they'd met. Tarrin felt her understanding of James shift and blur like a reflection in disturbed water. He'd been to Blackridge years before his disappearance, had known people there, had a connection to the place that predated everything she thought she knew about him. She opened the manila envelope next. Inside were photocopied documents, incident reports, safety violations, correspondence between mining company executives and state officials. One letter, dated 2004, was from someone named Howard Breslin, identified as a state senator, essentially ordering a safety investigator to close a case, despite evidence of violations. The cassette tape was labeled in James's handwriting. Breslin call, October 2004. Tarrin had no way to play it here. The motel room had a television bolted to the dresser and nothing else. She'd need to find a cassette player, something that might be difficult in 2025. She returned to the photograph, studying the faces of the other men. Vincent, Marcus, Leo. Were they the ones James had mentioned in the ledger? The ones who had died? A knock on the door startled her. She shoved the lockbox under the bed and went to the door, peering through the peephole. A woman stood outside, older, wearing a cardigan despite the mild evening. Tarrin opened the door partway. "Yes? I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. Her voice was gentle, careful. "My name is Stella Hayward. I used to work at the county office with you, back before you left. Gordon at the general store mentioned you were in town. I thought I'd check if you needed anything." Tarrin remembered her, vaguely, a face from another lifetime. "I'm fine, thank you." "I heard about the auction," Stella continued. "About the storage unit. James's unit," she paused. "I'm glad someone who cared about him was able to get it. There's been talk over the years, you know. Questions about what really happened to him." Tarrin's grip tightened on the door. "What kind of questions?" Stella glanced down the motel walkway, then back. "The kind people don't ask out loud." James was looking into things before he disappeared. Things that made certain people uncomfortable. Some of us always thought there was more to it than a hiking accident. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a business card. "This is my number. If you need anything while you're here, or if you want to talk, please call." Tarrin took the card, studying Stella's face. "Did James ever mention Blackridge to you?" Stella's expression shifted, became more guarded. "He mentioned it once. Said he'd worked there years ago. He didn't like talking about it." She hesitated. "There was an accident there in the late 90s. A cave-in that killed 3 men. The official report said it was bad luck, unstable geology. But there were rumors it was negligence, that the company knew the tunnel was unsafe and sent men in anyway. Vincent, Marcus, and Leo? Tarrin asked quietly. Stella's eyes widened slightly. You found something in the storage unit. I found a lot of things. Tarrin looked past Stella at the parking lot, at the ordinary evening traffic on the highway beyond. And I think I'm just starting to understand what James was really doing. Be careful, Tarrin. Stella's voice dropped lower. Whatever James uncovered got him killed. Some of the people involved back then are still in power. They have a lot to lose if the truth comes out. After Stella left, Tarrin locked the door and sat on the bed, surrounded by boxes and evidence of a life she'd never fully known. The photograph lay beside her. 4 men frozen in time, 3 of them dead now. The 4th vanished. She thought about the mountains, about the cabin waiting in the high country, about the simplicity of a life where the hardest decisions involved where to place a snare trap or which trees to cut for firewood. She could pack everything back into the storage unit, return to Pinecrest, hike back up the trail, and let the past stay buried. But even as she thought it, she knew she couldn't. James had died trying to tell the truth. The least she could do was hear it. She picked up the ledger again and began reading from the beginning, taking notes on a pad of motel stationery, building a timeline of what James had discovered and when. The violations, the cover-ups, the men who died because someone valued profit over safety. By midnight, she had a list of questions. By 2 in the morning, she had a plan. At dawn, she would start looking for answers. She would find someone who remembered Blackridge, who knew about the accident, who could tell her about Vincent and Marcus and Leo, and she would find out what had happened to James on that March day 20 years ago. The truth was, somewhere in this town, in these documents, in the memories of people who'd chosen silence over risk, Tarrin Glade had spent 20 years in silence herself. She was done with it now. The Ridgeline Public Library opened at 9 on Sunday mornings, staffed by volunteers who rotated shifts throughout the week. Tarrin waited on the steps, her satchel heavy with photocopied documents and the photograph of James and the 3 men. The volunteer who unlocked the doors was a woman in her 70s with steel-grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and moved with the deliberate care of someone managing arthritis. A name tag pinned to her sweater read, Phoebe Larkin. "Good morning," Phoebe said, holding the door open. "You're an early visitor." "I'm looking for information about a mining town called Blackridge," Tarrin said. "History, old newspaper articles, anything you might have." Phoebe's expression shifted, became more attentive. "Blackridge. Now there's a name I haven't heard in years." "Come in, dear. Let's see what we can find." The library was small, just 3 rooms, one for current books, one for children's materials, and one for local history and archives. Phoebe led Tarrin to the back room, where filing cabinets lined the walls, and bound volumes of old newspapers sat on metal shelves. "Blackridge was a mining town about 3 hours north of here," Phoebe said, running her finger along the spines of newspaper volumes. "Copper and silver, mostly. Operated from the 20s through the late 90s, when the main company pulled out. There's not much left there now." She pulled down a volume marked 1998-1999 and carried it to a reading table. "What specifically are you looking for?" Tarrin hesitated, then pulled out the photograph. "I'm trying to find out about an accident that happened there. A cave-in, 3 men died." Phoebe took the photograph, studying it carefully. Her face went still. "Oh, Lord, that's Vincent." She pointed to the man on the left, younger in the photo but recognizable. "Vincent Larkin, my cousin's boy." The connection fell into place. Tarrin felt her pulse quicken. "You knew him?" "He was a good kid," Phoebe said quietly. 23 years old when he died. He'd just gotten married that spring. She looked up at Tarrin. "How do you have this photograph?" "It belonged to someone I cared about. James Cooper." Tarrin pointed to James in the picture. "He disappeared 20 years ago. I'm trying to understand why." Phoebe set the photograph down gently, as if it were fragile. "Let me show you something." She opened the newspaper volume to September 1998 and turned pages until she found what she was looking for. The headline read, 3 dead in Blackridge mine collapse. The article described how a tunnel in the north section of the Cordell mining operation had collapsed during a routine shift, trapping 3 workers, Vincent Larkin, Marcus Kenton, and Leonard Pike. Recovery efforts had taken 4 days. The company spokesman was quoted saying it was a tragic accident caused by unexpected geological instability. There was an investigation, Phoebe said, but it didn't amount to much. The state inspector ruled it was an act of nature, essentially. Cordell Mining paid out settlements to the families and shut down that section permanently. She paused. But Vincent's wife, she never believed it. She said Vincent had told her the company was cutting corners, that the tunnel supports weren't properly maintained. She tried to push for a deeper investigation, but she was just a young woman with no money and no influence. What happened to her? Tarrin asked. She moved away. Changed her name, I think. Too many painful memories here. Tarrin made notes on her pad, connecting pieces. James had known these men, had worked with them perhaps. Had he been there when the accident happened? Or had he learned about it later and started investigating? She pulled more documents from her satchel. The safety violation reports, the correspondence about covered-up incidents. Do these mean anything to you? Phoebe read through them carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is evidence of negligence. If this had come out back then, Cordell Mining would have faced serious consequences. Maybe criminal charges. She looked at Tarrin. Is this what your James was working on when he disappeared? I think so. Tarrin spread the documents across the table, creating a timeline. He was documenting violations across multiple sites, building a case. And then he vanished. Phoebe was quiet for a moment, then reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small brass key. She held it up to the light. This was Vincent's. It came back with his personal effects after the accident. I've kept it all these years, not knowing what it opened. There was a number engraved on it, 1847, but no one could figure out what it was for. Tarrin stared at the key, the same number that had been written on the lockbox. Can I see it? Phoebe handed it over. The key was old, worn smooth from handling, with 1847 etched into the brass. It was smaller than a house key, more like something that would open a locker or a safe deposit box. I found a similar number in James's things, Tarrin said slowly. It opened a lockbox, but there might be more, another location, something this key accesses. Whatever it opens, Vincent wanted it protected, Phoebe said. He gave it to his wife a week before he died, told her to keep it safe, but didn't tell her what it was for. After the accident, she gave it to me, said she couldn't bear to look at it anymore. Tarrin held the key, feeling its weight. This was more than a coincidence. Vincent had hidden something, and James had known about it, had perhaps been trying to find it when he disappeared. Did Vincent or the other men work specifically in safety inspection? Tarrin asked. No, they were regular miners. But Marcus Kenton, he was a crew chief. He would have known about safety protocols, would have seen violations firsthand. Phoebe paused. His fiancée might know more. She still lives in the area, up in the hills near Blackridge. Woman named Louise Kenton. She never married after Marcus died. Just retreated from everything. Tarrin wrote down the name. Another person shaped by loss, another life interrupted by whatever had happened at Blackridge. Why are you doing this? Phoebe asked gently. After 20 years, why dig it all up now? Because I spent 20 years hiding in the mountains, telling myself James was gone, and that was the end of it. Tarrin met Phoebe's eyes. I was wrong. He wasn't just gone. He was silenced. And if I don't finish what he started, then his death meant nothing. Phoebe nodded slowly. The not knowing is worse than any truth. I learned that with Vincent. She touched the photograph. But be careful, dear. Whoever silenced James is still out there. They've had 20 years to feel safe. They won't take kindly to someone asking questions. Tarrin spent another hour in the library, photocopying articles and making notes. When she finally left, the brass key was in her pocket, warm against her palm. She had a new destination now, Blackridge itself, and the woman named Louise Kenton, who might hold more pieces of the puzzle. The walk back to the motel took her through the center of town. She passed the coffee shop where she and James used to sit on Sunday mornings, reading the paper and planning their week. The memory was sharp and painful, but for the first time in 20 years, it didn't make her want to run back to the mountains. Instead, it made her determined to see this through. Back in her room, she spread out a map of the region marking Blackridge's location. 3 hours by car, longer if she had to find rides or walk parts of it. She had maybe $50 left after paying for the motel, enough for a few days if she was careful. She picked up the key again, studying the number. Somewhere in or near Blackridge, there was a lock this key would open. And whatever was behind that lock was important enough that Vincent had hidden it. Important enough that James had been killed trying to find it. Tomorrow, she would start the journey north. Tonight, she would prepare. She laid out her supplies. Water bottle, the documents, warm clothes, the photograph, the key. Everything she needed to walk into the past and demand it give up its secrets. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Tarrin stood at the window and watched it, thinking about James, about Vincent and Marcus and Leonard, about all the truths buried under 20 years of silence. The not knowing is worse than any truth, Phoebe had said. Tarrin was about to find out if that was really the case. Tarrin left Ridgeline before dawn on Monday, catching a ride with a delivery driver who was heading north toward the mountain communities. He dropped her at a crossroads 40 miles out, and from there she walked, following the 2-lane highway that wound through high desert country, dotted with sage and juniper. The landscape changed as she traveled, growing more rugged and remote. By mid-morning, she reached the turnoff for Blackridge, a gravel road marked by a weathered sign that read, Blackridge, 12 mi. The paint was faded, the post leaning at an angle. No one had maintained it in years. She walked the gravel road under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and her pack felt light after years of carrying heavier loads in the mountains. The rhythm of walking steadied her thoughts, helped her organize what she knew and what she still needed to discover. Blackridge appeared gradually, first as distant buildings on the horizon, then as a collection of weathered structures clustered in a valley between low hills. Most of the buildings were abandoned. Houses with collapsed roofs, a boarded-up store, the rusted skeleton of mining equipment scattered across the scrubland. But there were signs of life, too. A few homes showed maintenance, with trucks parked outside and smoke rising from chimneys. She found the old mining office by following the coordinates James had written in his notes. It was a single-story building of cinder block and corrugated metal, set apart from the residential area. The windows were intact, but filmed with dirt, and the door was secured with a heavy padlock. Tarrin studied the lock, then looked at the key Phoebe had given her. The number matched, 1847. She fitted the key into the lock and turned. It resisted at first, the mechanism stiff from disuse, then clicked open. The door swung inward on hinges that shrieked in protest. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Light filtered through the dirty windows, illuminating a scene frozen in time. Desks still held papers and coffee mugs. Filing cabinets lined the walls. A calendar from 1999 hung askew on one wall, showing a mountain landscape. Tarrin moved carefully through the space, her boots leaving prints in the dust. She tried the filing cabinets. Most were locked, but one drawer opened when she pulled. Inside were personnel files, incident reports, maintenance logs. She pulled out a handful and carried them to the desk by the window, where the light was better. The incident reports made for grim reading. Multiple complaints about tunnel supports, about rushed inspections, about equipment failures that were patched rather than replaced. She found Marcus Kenton's name on several reports. He'd filed formal complaints in the months before his death, documenting unsafe conditions in the North Tunnel section. Each complaint had been marked, reviewed, no action required, and signed by someone named Vernon Walsh, the site supervisor. Tarrin was so absorbed in the documents that she didn't hear the truck pull up outside. The first indication she had of company was the sound of boots on gravel, then the door swinging wider. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the midday sun. He was in his 70s, lean and weathered, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt. His hand rested on the doorframe, but he didn't step inside. Figured someone would come eventually, he said. His voice was rough like gravel tumbling in a mixer. Took longer than I expected. Tarrin stood slowly, keeping the desk between them. Are you Vernon Walsh? I am. He stepped inside now, moving carefully around the debris on the floor. And you're the woman who bought James Cooper's storage unit. Word travels in small places, even places that are mostly empty now. You knew James? I knew him. Vernon pulled out a desk chair and sat down with a sigh. Knew him better than I wanted to toward the end. He came here in 2004, asking questions about the accident, about Marcus and Vincent and Leo, about what really happened in that tunnel. Tarrin sat back down, watching him carefully. What did you tell him? The truth. That I'd signed off on those complaints without acting on them because I was told to. That I'd been pressured by the company to keep things running, to not make waves, to prioritize production over safety. Vernon's jaw tightened. I've carried that weight for 26 years. Those boys died because I was a coward. The admission hung in the air between them. Tarrin pulled out the photograph and slid it across the desk. James was with them before the accident. He knew them. Vernon looked at the photo, his expression softening. James worked here in 97 and 98 as a junior inspector. He was friends with Marcus especially. They used to go fishing together on their days off. He touched Marcus's face in the photo. When the accident happened, James tried to get a real investigation started. Wrote letters, made calls, got nowhere. The company had connections, people in the state office who made sure the official report said what it needed to say. So James left. He left because he was told to leave. Told that if he kept pushing, he'd have an accident of his own. Vernon looked up at her. He left, but he never stopped. He spent years gathering evidence, documenting violations at other sites, building a case that couldn't be ignored, until someone made sure he couldn't finish it. Tarrin's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Vernon nodded. I heard about his disappearance. Read about it in the paper. I knew what it meant, but I didn't have the courage to come forward. I'd already lost my nerve once. Couldn't seem to find it again. Tarrin felt anger rising in her chest, but beneath it was something else, understanding. Vernon had been caught in the same machinery that had killed James, the same system that valued profit over life. He'd made the wrong choice, but he'd been living with it ever since. There are more documents, she said. Letters between company executives and a state senator. Evidence of a cover-up that went beyond just Blackridge. Vernon's eyes sharpened. A senator? Who? Howard Breslin. Vernon let out a long breath. That makes sense. Breslin was on the Mining Oversight Committee back then. Cordell Mining contributed heavily to his campaigns. We all knew he was in their pocket, but proving it was another matter. James had proof. Tarrin pulled out the copied letters. Communications showing Breslin ordering investigations closed, threatening whistleblowers. And there's a recording, a phone call. I haven't been able to listen to it yet, but James labeled it Breslin Call. Vernon took the letters, reading through them slowly. His hands shook slightly. This is what got James killed. If this had come out, Breslin's career would have ended. Maybe criminal charges. He had everything to lose. He still does, Tarrin said. According to what I've learned, Breslin is still a senator. Still in office. Then he's still dangerous. Vernon set the letters down. You can't go to the local authorities with this. Breslin has too many connections, too much influence. You'd need to go higher. Federal, maybe. Or the press. Tarrin thought about that, about what it would take to make people listen after 20 years. There's someone else I need to talk to first. Louise Kenton, Marcus's fiancée. Vernon's expression grew pained. Louise, poor woman. She tried so hard to get justice for Marcus. When she couldn't, when everyone told her to let it go, she just broke. Moved up into the hills, barely talks to anyone anymore. Do you know where she lives? About 5 miles north of here, up an old logging road. You'll need directions. It's not marked. He pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket and drew a rough map. But I'm warning you, she might not want to talk. She's been hurt too many times. Tarrin took the map. I have to try. She deserves to know that Marcus was right, that people are finally listening. Vernon stood, moving toward the door. He paused at the threshold and looked back. James gave me something before he disappeared. A map. I've kept it all these years, not knowing what to do with it. Maybe you're the person who's supposed to have it. A map of what? The mine tunnels, marked with locations, places where bodies were hidden, where evidence was buried. James told me if anything happened to him, someone would come looking. I think he meant you. Tarrin's breath caught. Can I see it? Come to my place tonight. I live in the 3rd house on the east side of town, the one with the blue door. I'll give you the map and anything else I have that might help. Vernon's voice was quiet but firm. James was a good man. He deserved better than what he got. If you're going to finish what he started, you'll need everything we can give you. After Vernon left, Tarrin stayed in the office, continuing to sort through documents. She found more complaints, more evidence of systematic negligence. Each piece added weight to the case James had been building. By late afternoon, her satchel was heavy with photocopied reports and notes. She locked the office behind her and walked into Blackridge proper, looking for a place to wait until evening. The town was quiet, almost ghost-like. She found a small diner that was still operating and ordered coffee and soup, paying with some of her remaining cash. The waitress was friendly, but incurious, clearly used to strangers passing through. As Tarrin ate, she thought about James, about the young man in the photograph, standing with his friends, not knowing that most of them would be dead within months. About the older James she'd known, the careful, methodical man who'd hidden his crusade behind a mask of ordinary life. He'd protected her by keeping her ignorant. She understood that now. He'd loved her enough to bear the burden alone, but he shouldn't have had to. And she was done being protected. When the sky began to darken, she walked to Vernon's house, the 3rd one with the blue door. He answered immediately, as if he'd been watching for her. Inside, the house was simple and clean, a bachelor's space with few decorations beyond a few photographs on the mantel. Vernon led her to the kitchen table, where a large sheet of paper was already spread out. The map showed the underground tunnel system of Blackridge Mine in meticulous detail. Red X's marked several locations, each labeled with a date and initials. These are where they hid the evidence, Vernon said quietly. Bodies of men who died in accidents that were never reported. Equipment failures that were buried literally and figuratively. James marked every location he could verify. Tarrin stared at the map, understanding the depth of what James had uncovered. This wasn't just negligence. It was a criminal conspiracy that had lasted decades. There's one more thing, Vernon said. He handed her a folded piece of paper. An address. James told me if he didn't come back from his meeting with someone named Randall Price, I should make sure this got to the right person. It's Price's last known location, or at least it was 20 years ago. Tarrin took the address. Another name, another thread to follow. She stayed at Vernon's house that night, sleeping on his couch with the map and documents secured in her satchel. In the morning, she would continue north to find Louise Kenton. The truth was getting closer. She could feel it. Vernon drove Tarrin up the logging road the next morning in his old pickup truck, the suspension creaking over ruts and exposed rocks. The road climbed steadily through pine forest, narrow and overgrown, clearly unused except by the occasional hiker or hunter. Louise comes to town maybe twice a year, Vernon said, navigating around a fallen branch. Buys supplies, trades for what she needs, then disappears back up here. People tried to reach out at first after Marcus died, but she made it clear she wanted to be left alone. Tarrin watched the forest pass outside the window, recognizing the kind of isolation Louise had chosen. It was the same impulse that had driven her to the mountains, a need to escape the world that had failed to protect what mattered most. The cabin appeared after 40 minutes of driving, set in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was sturdy but spare, built from logs with a metal roof and a stone chimney. A vegetable garden occupied the sunny side of the clearing, and split firewood was stacked neatly against the north wall. Vernon parked a respectful distance away and killed the engine. "Let me go first. She knows me at least a little." They approached on foot, and before they'd gotten halfway to the door, it opened. A woman stepped out onto the narrow porch, holding a rifle loosely across her chest. She was in her early 50s, dressed in canvas pants and a wool sweater, her dark hair streaked with grey and pulled back in a practical braid. "Vernon," she said, her voice flat. "I told you last time I didn't need checking on." "I'm not here to check on you, Louise." Vernon stopped at the edge of the porch. "I'm here because this woman needs to talk to you." "It's about Marcus." Louise's eyes shifted to Tarrin, assessing her with the kind of wariness that came from too much hurt. "Marcus has been dead for 26 years. There's nothing to talk about." "There is," Tarrin said quietly. "James Cooper was working to prove Marcus was right about the safety violations. James was killed for it. I'm trying to finish what he started." The name registered. Louise's grip on the rifle tightened, then loosened. "James Cooper. I remember him. He was Marcus's friend. He was also someone I loved," Tarrin said. "And he disappeared 20 years ago because he wouldn't stop asking questions about what happened here." Louise was silent for a long moment, then leaned the rifle against the cabin wall. "Come inside, both of you." The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, a single large room with a sleeping area separated by a curtain, a wood stove for heat and cooking, shelves lined with preserves and dried goods. A table by the window held books and what looked like journal pages. Louise poured coffee from a pot on the stove, handing mugs to Vernon and Tarrin. They sat at the table, and for a moment no one spoke. "Marcus knew the tunnel was unsafe," Louise finally said. "He'd filed reports, made complaints. They told him it was under review, that they'd address it. Then they sent him into that section anyway." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly around her mug. "He came home the night before and told me he was going to refuse. Said he'd rather lose his job than risk his life and his crew's lives in a tunnel he knew was unstable. But he went in anyway," Tarrin said gently. "His supervisor told him if he refused, he'd be blacklisted. Wouldn't be able to find work anywhere in the industry. We were planning to get married that fall. We needed the money." Louise stared into her coffee. "So he went in, and 3 hours later the tunnel collapsed." Vernon's face was drawn with old guilt. "I should have backed him up. Should have shut down that section." "You were scared," Louise said without bitterness. "We all were. The company made it clear what happened to people who caused problems." She looked at Tarrin. "After the funerals, I tried to push for a real investigation. Contacted the state, hired a lawyer with money I didn't have. Got nowhere. The official report blamed geology, and that was the end of it." "It wasn't the end," Tarrin said. She pulled out the documents, the map, the photograph. "James spent years gathering evidence. He found proof that Cordell Mining knew about the violations, that they falsified safety reports, that a state senator helped cover it up." Louise looked through the documents slowly, her expression hardening. "Senator Breslin. We always suspected he was involved, but we couldn't prove it. James could prove it." Tarrin showed her the letter with Breslin's signature. "And there's a recording, a phone call where Breslin allegedly orders evidence suppressed. I haven't been able to listen to it yet, but it's part of what James collected. Where is this recording now?" "Back in Ridgeline with the rest of James's evidence. I need to find someone who can authenticate it, someone who can help me take this public without getting buried the way James was." Louise set down the papers and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. She opened it and pulled out a folder, bringing it back to the table. "James came to see me a month before he disappeared. He asked about Marcus, about what had happened, about what I knew. I showed him everything I had. Marcus's personal notes, copies of his complaints, letters I'd written that went unanswered." She opened the folder, revealing Marcus's handwriting on lined paper, notes about tunnel conditions, sketches of support structures, dated observations. James said he was going to make sure Marcus's death mattered, that all of their deaths would matter. He said he'd found someone who could help him, someone in the state investigator's office who'd been forced out for asking too many questions. "Randall Price," Tarrin said. Louise nodded. That was the name. James said they were going to meet, that Price had the final piece of evidence they needed. After that meeting, James was going to go public with everything. Her voice dropped. "He told me if anything happened to him, someone would come eventually. Someone who cared enough to finish it." "I care," Tarrin said simply. "And I'm not stopping until the truth is out there." Louise studied her for a long moment, then reached into the folder and pulled out a folded deed. "James gave me this for safekeeping. He said if he didn't come back, I should give it to whoever came looking. It's a property deed, a cabin he bought under a different name. He said that's where he was keeping all the evidence, somewhere safe where the company in Breslin couldn't find it." Tarrin took the deed, her hands shaking slightly. The property was described as a remote parcel, 15 miles northeast of Blackridge, accessible only by hiking trail. James Cooper wasn't listed as the owner. Instead, it was registered to J.C. Thorne. He bought it a week before he disappeared, Louise said. "Paid cash, used a fake name. He was planning for the worst." Vernon leaned forward. "That cabin, I know where it is. It's up near Eagles Point, where James was supposed to meet Price. The trail is rough, but I can get you there." Tarrin looked at the deed, understanding now the full scope of what James had done. He'd created a safe house for evidence, a place where everything would be preserved if he didn't survive to see the truth revealed. "I need to see it," she said. "Everything James gathered, it's probably still there." "It's a hard hike," Vernon warned. 5 miles up steep terrain. "We should go tomorrow morning, get an early start." Louise stood. "I'm coming too." Both Vernon and Tarrin looked at her in surprise. "I've hidden up here for 26 years, Louise said, her voice firm. "Telling myself it was safer to stay silent, that speaking out would only bring more pain. But you're right, Marcus's death has to matter. If there's a chance to finally get justice for him, for Vincent and Leo, for all of them, I'm not going to let fear stop me anymore." Tarrin felt something shift in her chest, the recognition of shared experience, of two women who'd let loss drive them into isolation, finally finding the courage to step back into the world. "Then we go together," she said. That night, Tarrin stayed at Louise's cabin, while Vernon returned to town for supplies. The two women sat by the wood stove, talking in the quiet way of people who understood each other's grief without needing detailed explanations. "I was angry at Marcus for going into that tunnel," Louise admitted. "Angry that he chose the job over his safety, over our future. It took me years to understand he didn't have a real choice. The system was rigged against him from the start. I was angry at James for leaving me in the dark," Tarrin said, "for not trusting me with the truth. But he was protecting me. If I'd known what he was doing, I would have been in danger too." They were both trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. Louise poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "The real question is whether we can finish what they started without getting ourselves killed in the process." It was a fair question, one Tarrin had been avoiding. Breslin was still powerful, still connected. Going after him meant becoming visible, vulnerable. But the alternative, walking away, letting James's death and Marcus's death and all the others fade back into silence, was unthinkable. "We'll be careful," Tarrin said. "We'll document everything, make copies, go to the press and federal authorities simultaneously. Make it too public for anyone to quietly dispose of." Louise nodded slowly. "I hope that's enough." In the morning, they would hike to James's hidden cabin and finally see what he'd spent his last months gathering. Tarrin tried to sleep but found herself staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she might find there, not just evidence and documents, but perhaps some final message from James, some explanation of his last days. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, the truth starts coming into the light. Vernon arrived at Louise's cabin before sunrise, his truck loaded with water, supplies, and a sense of quiet determination. The three of them set out as the first light touched the tops of the pines. Following a trail that was more memory than path, Tarrin moved easily over the rough terrain, her years in the mountains having prepared her for this kind of hiking. Louise kept pace with surprising stamina, and Vernon, despite his age, navigated with the confidence of someone who'd walked these hills his entire life. They didn't talk much during the climb. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, wind moving through branches, the occasional rustle of wildlife in the undergrowth. The trail switched back and forth up the mountainside, gaining elevation steadily. After 2 hours, they stopped at a small spring to refill water bottles. Vernon consulted the deed, comparing it to landmarks he remembered. Another hour, maybe a bit more, he said. The cabin should be just below Eagle's Point, tucked back in the trees where you wouldn't see it unless you knew where to look. They continued upward, the air thinning, the trees becoming more sparse. Finally, Vernon held up his hand, pointing ahead to where a structure was just visible through the pines. The cabin was small, built of weathered logs with a pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow. The windows were intact but dusty, and the door was closed with a heavy padlock. The clearing around it was overgrown, suggesting no one had been here in years. Tarrin approached slowly, feeling James's presence in every detail, the careful construction, the remote location, the paranoia that had driven him to create this hiding place. The padlock was old but solid. Vernon tried the key from Vincent's effects, but it didn't fit. Tarrin looked around and found a large rock near the woodpile. "Stand back," she said, and brought the rock down hard on the lock. It took 3 strikes before the hasp broke free. The door swung open, and they stepped inside. The cabin's interior was a shrine to James's investigation. Papers covered every surface, pinned to walls, spread across a makeshift table, stacked in boxes. Photographs were arranged in clusters, connected by strings of red yarn, marking relationships and timelines. A filing cabinet stood in one corner, and a small wood stove occupied the center of the room. On the table was an old cassette player, and beside it a tape labeled Final Account JC. Tarrin moved through the space in a daze, taking in the scope of what James had assembled. Maps of mine tunnels, personnel records, financial documents, safety violations going back decades. It was all here, years of meticulous research, organized and cross-referenced. Louise found a corkboard with photographs of the 3 men who died in the collapse. Beneath each photo, James had written their names, ages and families they'd left behind. His handwriting was steady, but Tarrin could see the weight of responsibility in every careful letter. Vernon opened the filing cabinet and let out a low whistle. He's got copies of everything. Every complaint, every falsified report, every payment from Cordell Mining to Breslin's campaign. This is enough to bring down the whole operation. Tarrin picked up a leather-bound journal from the table. The cover was embossed with James's initials. She opened it carefully, seeing his handwriting fill every page, a record of his investigation. His thoughts, his fears. She turned to a random entry, dated 6 months before his disappearance. "I'm getting close. Randall Price has agreed to go on record, and with his testimony plus the documents I've gathered, we'll have enough to force a federal investigation. But I'm being followed now. Twice this week, I've seen the same car parked near the house. I haven't told Tarrin. I can't make her a target. If something happens to me, at least she'll be safe." Tarrin's vision blurred with tears. She turned pages, reading more. "I watch her in the morning light and want to tell her everything, but I can't make her a target. She deserves better than to be dragged into this darkness. Sometimes I think about just walking away, taking her somewhere far from here and forgetting about Blackridge, about Marcus and Vincent and Leo. But I can't. Their families deserve the truth. The men still working in unsafe conditions deserve protection. I have to see this through." Another entry from 2 weeks before he disappeared. "Meeting with Randall tomorrow at Eagle's Point. He's bringing the recorded call. Breslin explicitly ordering him to bury evidence. With that, we'll have everything we need. I've made copies of all the documents, hidden them here and in the storage unit. If anything happens to me, someone will find them eventually. Maybe Tarrin, maybe someone else, but the truth will come out." The final entry was dated the day before he vanished. "If I don't return from this meeting, I want Tarrin to know I loved her more than I could ever say. I'm sorry I had to keep secrets. I'm sorry I couldn't give her the life we planned. But I couldn't look away from what I'd seen. Marcus was my friend, and he died because people chose profit over safety. I can't let that stand. If this is the end, at least I'll have done something that mattered." Tarrin closed the journal, her chest tight. She'd spent 20 years believing James had chosen this crusade over her, but now She understood. He'd been trying to protect her while also honoring the memory of his friend. "Tarrin," Louise said softly. She was standing by the window, looking at a map pinned to the wall. "You need to see this." The map showed the area around Eagles Point, with a trail marked in red. At the overlook, James had drawn a circle and written, "Meeting location, March 15th, 2005, 2 p.m. Vernon came to stand beside them. "Eagles Point is about 2 miles from here. It's where James was supposed to meet Randall Price. It's probably where he died," Tarrin said quietly. They spent the rest of the morning cataloging everything in the cabin. The cassette tape went into Tarrin's satchel, along with the journal and the most crucial documents. They created an inventory, noting where everything was located in case they needed to come back. As afternoon approached, Tarrin made a decision. "I need to see Eagles Point." Vernon hesitated. "Tarrin, there might not be anything there after 20 years. I know. But I need to see it anyway." They left the cabin and followed the trail James had marked on his map. It climbed steeply through rocky terrain, emerging finally at a granite overlook with sweeping views of the valley below. Eagles Point was breathtaking and isolated, the kind of place where something could happen and no one would know. Tarrin walked to the edge carefully, looking down at the drop. It was easily 200 feet to the rocks below. She scanned the area, looking for anything James might have left behind. Louise found it first, a scrap of fabric caught on a bush near the cliff edge. Weathered and faded, but recognizable as denim. Beside it, half buried in pine needles, was a broken watchband. Tarrin knelt and picked up the watchband, turning it over in her hands. It was leather, worn smooth from years of wear. She'd given James a watch for his birthday 2 years before he disappeared. The band had looked like this. "This is where it happened," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they killed him." Vernon crouched beside her, examining the area with practiced eyes. The meeting was supposed to be at 2 in the afternoon. Good visibility, but isolated enough that no one would see what happened. They probably waited for him, maybe pretended to be Price, then pushed him over the edge. Made it look like a hiking accident if anyone ever found the body. Louise stood at a distance, her arms wrapped around herself. "Did Price ever show up?" "I don't know," Tarrin said. "Maybe they got to him first. Or maybe he saw something and ran." She gathered the fabric and watchband carefully, placing them in her satchel. They were small things, fragments of a person, but they were all she had of James's final moments. The 3 of them stood at Eagles Point as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. 20 years had passed since James had stood here, expecting to meet an ally, and instead meeting his death. 20 years of silence, of covered-up truth, of justice delayed. "We're going to..." Louise, emerging from her isolation to fight for the justice she'd been denied. 2 people who'd been broken by the same system that had killed James, now ready to stand against it. "We leave tomorrow morning," Tarrin said. "Early. We drive to Montana, find Price, and then we go to the media. We find a journalist who can't be bought or intimidated, and we give them everything." They spent the rest of the night preparing. Vernon packed his truck with supplies. Louise returned to her cabin to gather what she needed. Tarrin sat alone in Vernon's kitchen, reading through James's journal one more time, memorizing his words, his hopes, his determination. One entry from late in his investigation stood out. "I think about Tarrin every day, about the life we could have had if I'd just let this go. But I can't. When I close my eyes, I see Marcus's face. I see Vincent and Leo. I see all the men who've died because someone prioritized money over human life. If I walk away, if I stay silent, I'm complicit. I'm part of the machinery that grinds people up and spits them out. I can't live with that. So I push forward, even knowing it might cost me everything, because some things are worth dying for. Truth is one of them." Tarrin closed the journal and placed her hand on its cover. "I understand now," she whispered to the empty room. "I understand why you had to do this. And I promise I'll finish it." In the morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, the 3 of them loaded into Vernon's truck and headed north toward Montana. The evidence was secured in waterproof bags, copies hidden with trusted people back in Ridgeline. The cassette tape was in Tarrin's satchel, along with James's journal and the photograph of 4 young men who'd believed they were working towards something better. The road ahead was uncertain. Breslin was still in power, still dangerous. But they had the truth, documented and preserved. And they had each other, 3 survivors of the same tragedy, finally ready to speak as they drove through high country. Tarrin watched the landscape pass and thought about James standing at Eagle's Point, knowing he was walking into danger but going anyway. He'd been brave in a way she was only beginning to understand, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She would try to be that brave now. For him, for Marcus and Vincent and Leo, for all the people who'd been silenced, the truth was going to come out, whatever it cost. She pulled out the cassette tape, looking at James's careful handwriting on the label. This small object held the power to destroy a senator's career, to expose decades of corruption, to finally bring justice to families who'd waited too long. "We're coming for you, Breslin," she said softly. "And you won't see us coming until it's too late." Vernon glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "What was that?" "Nothing," Tarrin said. "Just making a promise." The truck rolled on through the morning, carrying them toward whatever came next. Behind them, the mountains where Tarrin had hidden for 20 years grew smaller. Ahead, somewhere in Montana, was a man who held the final piece of the puzzle, and beyond that, somewhere in the halls of power, was a senator who'd thought he'd gotten away with murder. His time was running out. The drive to Montana took most of the day, the landscape shifting from high desert to forest to the rolling hills of the northern Rockies. They stopped once for gas and food, speaking little, each of them processing what they were about to do. Tarrin sat in the back seat, reading through James's journal again. The entries from his final weeks revealed a man who'd made peace with his choices, who understood the risks and accepted them. One passage, dated a week before his death, struck her particularly hard. "I've been thinking about legacy today. Not the grand kind that gets remembered in history books, but the small kind. The difference one person can make by refusing to look away." Marcus refused to look away from unsafe conditions. Vincent and Leo stood with him. They died for it. If I can honor their courage by finishing what they started, then my life will have meant something. Even if no one remembers my name, even if I don't live to see justice done, the evidence will remain. Someone will find it. Someone will care. That has to be enough. Tarrin wiped at her eyes, careful not to let Vernon or Louise see. James had been right about one thing. Someone had found it. She'd found it, and she cared more than she could put into words. They reached Whitefish as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. It was a small town, the kind of place where tourists came in summer and winter for outdoor recreation, but emptied out in the shoulder seasons. Vernon pulled into a diner parking lot, and they went inside to ask about Randall Price. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, listened to their description and shook her head. "Name doesn't ring a bell, but I've only been here 5 years. You might try the library. They keep town records and directories. Opens at 9 tomorrow. They found a motel on the edge of town and took 2 rooms. Tarrin lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what they might find in the morning. Price could be dead, moved away, or so deep in hiding that they'd never locate him. Without his testimony, the case against Breslin was weaker, circumstantial evidence, and a recording that would require expert authentication. But it was better than nothing. And it was more than anyone had tried in 20 years. Morning came cold and clear. They ate breakfast at the diner, then walked to the library, a modest brick building on the main street. The librarian, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, listened to their inquiry with growing interest. "Randall Price," he repeated, typing into his computer. "Let me check our resident directories." He scrolled through screens, his brow furrowed. Nothing current. "But I can check historical records, see if he was ever registered here." It took 15 minutes of searching through archived documents before he found something. Here, Randall Price, listed at 1247 Spruce Road from 2006 to 2009. No listing after that. He was here, Tarrin said, her heart racing. Can you tell us anything else? The librarian hesitated, clearly weighing privacy concerns against the urgency in their faces. The property at that address is now owned by someone named Catherine Brennan. I don't know if there's any connection, but it's a start. They drove to Spruce Road, following the librarian's directions to a small house set back from the street, surrounded by tall pines. The mailbox read K. Brennan. Vernon parked, and they approached the front door together. A woman answered the knock, mid-60s, with grey hair cut short and sharp, intelligent eyes behind reading glasses. She studied them through the screen door without opening it. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cautious but not unfriendly. "We're looking for Randall Price," Tarrin said. "We believe he lived here at one time. It's important that we find him." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Why are you looking for him?" "We have evidence related to something he investigated 20 years ago, something that got a friend of ours killed. We need his help to make sure the people responsible finally face consequences." Catherine, if that was her name, was silent for a long moment. Then she unlatched the screen door and opened it. "Come in, but understand that if I don't like what I hear, you're leaving immediately." They filed into a modest living room filled with books and comfortable furniture. Catherine gestured for them to sit, then took a chair opposite them, her posture defensive but attentive. "My name is Catherine Brennan," she said. "And before you ask me anything else, I need to know who you are and why you're really here." Tarrin introduced herself, then Vernon and Louise. She explained about James's disappearance, the storage unit, the evidence they'd found, and the journey that had brought them here. She pulled out the cassette tape and James's journal, showing them to Catherine as proof of their sincerity. Catherine listened without interruption. When Tarrin finished, she was quiet for a long time, her hands folded in her lap. "Randall Price is my brother," she finally said. "He came here in 2005, barely able to walk, terrified someone was going to finish what they'd started. The car accident wasn't an accident. His brake lines had been cut. He survived by pure luck. Is he still alive?" Louise asked gently. "He is. He lives under a different name about an hour from here, in a cabin even more remote than this house. He spent the last 20 years looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to come after him again." Catherine's voice hardened. "What makes you think I'm going to tell you where he is?" "Because we're going to expose the man who tried to kill him," Tarrin said. "Senator Breslin. We have the recording of him threatening your brother. We have documents showing years of corruption and cover-ups. We have evidence of multiple deaths caused by negligence he helped conceal. With your brother's testimony, we can bring him down. You'll also make Randall a target again. Breslin is 76 years old and up for re-election this year," Vernon said. "If we move fast, if we go public with everything simultaneously, Breslin won't have time to retaliate. He'll be too busy trying to save his political career." Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the trees. "Randall has been in hiding for 2 decades. The guilt of not speaking up has eaten at him every day. He knows people died because he stayed silent after Breslin forced him out. But he was also protecting his family, protecting me and my children." She turned back to face them. "If you do this, if you bring him out of hiding, you have to promise me you'll keep him safe, that you won't let Breslin's people get to him." "We can't guarantee anything," Tarrin said honestly. "But we can promise that we'll move fast, that we'll go to multiple media outlets and law enforcement simultaneously, that we'll make it too public for anyone to quietly dispose of us. And we'll make sure Randall's testimony is recorded and distributed before Breslin even knows we've found him." Catherine studied each of their faces in turn, assessing their resolve. Finally, she reached for her phone. "I'll call him. Tell him what you've told me. The decision will be his, not mine." She stepped into another room to make the call. Through the closed door, they could hear the murmur of conversation, but not the words. Vernon paced. Louise sat with her hands clasped tightly, and Tarrin held the journal, running her fingers over James's name embossed on the cover. When Catherine returned, her expression was unreadable. "He'll meet with you tomorrow morning at a location he'll choose. He wants to see the evidence first, verify it's legitimate. If he's satisfied, he'll tell you his story." Relief flooded through Tarrin. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," Catherine said. "My brother is a good man who was put in an impossible situation. If this goes wrong, if Breslin comes after him again, I'll hold you responsible." They spent that evening at Catherine's house, organizing their evidence and preparing for the meeting. Catherine made dinner, and over the meal, she told them about Randall, about the idealistic young investigator who'd believed the system would protect people who told the truth, and the broken man who'd learned how naive that belief had been. He never married, Catherine said. Never had children. Said it wouldn't be fair to bring people into his life when he was always looking over his shoulder. The accident, the attempted murder, cost him more than just his safety. It cost him the life he should have had. Tarrin thought about her own 20 years in the mountains, the life she'd abandoned after James disappeared. "I understand that better than you might think." That night Tarrin couldn't sleep again. She sat on the motel bed with the journal open on her lap, reading James's words by lamplight. Near the end, she found a passage she'd missed before. "I wonder sometimes if I'm making the right choice, if exposing all this corruption is worth dying for. Then I remember Marcus's wedding plans, cut short by corporate greed. I remember Vincent's young wife, left alone before their first anniversary. I remember Leo's kids, who grew up without a father. And I know that silence isn't an option. Someone has to speak. Someone has to refuse to look away. If that someone is me, then so be it. I just hope that when I'm gone, someone else will pick up where I left off. Someone braver, stronger, more determined. Someone who won't let the truth die with me." Tarrin pressed her hand to the page, feeling connected across time to the man she'd loved. "I'm here," she whispered. "I found it. I'm finishing it. Just like you hoped." In the morning, Catherine drove them to the meeting location, a state park 20 miles outside town, nearly empty in the off-season. They hiked to a picnic area overlooking a lake, where a man waited at a table, his back to the trail. As they approached, he turned. Randall Price was in his late 60s, with thinning grey hair and a weathered face. But his eyes were sharp, alert, carrying the permanent wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Catherine says you have evidence," he said without preamble. "Show me." Tarrin sat across from him and spread out the documents. The letters, the safety reports, the financial records showing payments from Cordell Mining to Breslin's campaigns. Finally, she pulled out the cassette tape. "This is your recording," she said. "The phone call with Breslin. We've already listened to it." Randall took the tape with shaking hands. "I made this recording because I knew he'd deny everything if I ever accused him publicly. I needed proof." He looked up at them. "After the accident, after I realized they'd tried to kill me, I went into hiding. I wanted to come forward, but I was terrified. And as time passed, it became easier to stay hidden than to face what speaking up would cost me." "It's not too late," Louise said. "The families of those men, they're still waiting for justice. They deserve to know the truth." Randall's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I've known for 20 years. It's haunted me every single day." Vernon leaned forward. "Help us bring Breslin down. Testify to what happened, authenticate this recording, corroborate the evidence James gathered. Give those families the justice they've been denied." Randall was quiet for a long time, staring out at the lake. Finally he nodded. "All right, I'll do it. Tell me what you need." They spent the next 3 hours there, recording Randall's testimony on video, having him verify each document, explain the context of his investigation and Breslin's threats. By the time they finished, they had everything they needed to build an airtight case. As they prepared to leave, Randall touched Tarrin's arm. "You said a friend of yours was killed for this. What was his name?" "James Cooper." Randall's face went pale. "James. He was going to meet me at Eagle's Point. I was in the hospital, couldn't warn him the meeting was compromised. I've wondered for 20 years if he went anyway, if he couldn't finish. He knew it was a trap," Tarrin said gently. "He went anyway, hoping to draw them out. He died trying to protect the evidence and make sure the truth would eventually come to light. Then we owe it to him to see this through, Randall said, his voice firm despite the tears on his face. No more hiding, no more silence. They left the park as the sun reached its zenith, carrying with them the final piece of the puzzle. Now came the hardest part, making the truth public and surviving whatever Breslin might throw at them in response. They returned to Catherine's house to plan their next move. The evidence was compelling, but getting it into the right hands required careful strategy. One wrong step could give Breslin time to mobilize his resources, to threaten or bribe people into silence, to make the whole thing disappear the way he'd made so many other investigations disappear. We need a journalist, Tarrin said. Someone with a reputation for integrity who can't be bought off or intimidated. Randall sat at the table, looking more alive than he had in years, despite the obvious fear in his eyes. There's a reporter at the regional paper, Pamela Osgood. She's been covering political corruption for decades. If anyone will run with this story, it's her. Vernon pulled out his phone and searched for her contact information. She's still working, based in Helena. Won an award last year for investigative journalism. We need to approach her carefully, Louise said. Give her enough to verify our story is legitimate, but not so much that we lose control of when it goes public. They spent the next hour crafting a message to Pamela Osgood, explaining in broad terms what they had and why it mattered. Vernon sent it from his email, marking it urgent. While they waited for a response, they made additional copies of everything, storing them in multiple locations: Catherine's safe, a bank deposit box in Whitefish, and Vernon's truck. The reply came within 2 hours. Pamela wanted to meet immediately. She could be in Whitefish by evening. They chose a restaurant on the main street, public enough to be safe, but quiet enough for private conversation. Pamela Osgood arrived at 6, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She carried a weathered leather bag and wore the slightly rumpled look of someone who cared more about substance than appearance. Vernon made the introductions. Pamela listened, taking notes on a small pad, asking clarifying questions that showed she understood the implications of what they were telling her. Sure, saying a sitting state senator has been covering up mining, deaths and corporate corruption for over 30 years, she said. Her voice neutral but her eyes intense. And you have documentary evidence plus eyewitness testimony from the state investigator he threatened into silence. That's exactly what we're saying, Tarrin replied. She slid a folder across the table containing copies of key documents. Not everything, but enough to prove they were serious. Pamela spent 20 minutes reviewing the materials, her expression growing more focused with each page. When she reached the transcript of the recorded phone call, she looked up sharply. You have the actual recording? We do. Along with video testimony from Randall Price, authenticating it and explaining the context. This is explosive. Pamela set down the papers carefully. If even half of this is verified, Breslin's career is over. Possibly criminal charges, definitely congressional investigation. But she paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn. This also makes you all extremely vulnerable. The moment this story breaks, you become targets. Are you prepared for that? Oh, we've been targets for 20 years, Randall said quietly. Some of us just didn't realize it. I'm done hiding. Pamela nodded slowly, respect showing in her face. Then here's what I propose. I'll take this back to Helena, spend tomorrow verifying what I can through independent sources. If everything checks out, and I suspect it will, I'll write a comprehensive piece that runs day after tomorrow. That gives us time to coordinate with federal authorities and ensure your safety. What about Breslin? Vernon asked. Won't he get wind of it? Not if we're careful. I'll make my inquiries through back channels, people I trust, and I'll time the publication to coincide with simultaneous delivery of evidence to the FBI and the state. Attorney General's office. She pulled out her phone, typing rapidly. I have contacts in both offices who've been looking for an excuse to investigate Breslin for years. This gives them the ammunition they need. Tarrin felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. After 20 years, After so much loss and silence, the truth was finally about to come out. But Pamela was right. The moment it did, they'd all be exposed. "There's one more thing," Tarrin said. She pulled out the photograph of James and the 3 miners. "The man who compiled most of this evidence was killed for it. His name was James Cooper. Whatever story you write, please make sure he's remembered." Pamela took the photograph, studying it carefully. "I'll make sure. The whole story, the men who died, the whistleblowers who were silenced, the families who never got justice. All of it." She looked up, her expression fierce. "This is the kind of story journalists live for. The chance to expose real corruption, to hold powerful people accountable. Trust me, I won't let you down." They spent another hour with Pamela, providing additional context and background, answering her detailed questions. By the time she left, carrying copies of evidence in her leather bag, Tarrin felt a strange lightness in her chest. The burden of carrying this secret alone was finally being shared. Back at the motel that night, she stood at the window looking out at the dark mountains, thinking about James. In 2 days, his death would finally mean something beyond private grief. The truth he'd died protecting would be known. The people he'd fought for would get their justice. "We did it," she whispered to the darkness. "We're finishing what you started." The next day passed in tense waiting. Pamela called twice to confirm details, and by evening she'd verified enough of their story through independent sources to move forward. The article would publish Sunday morning, both online and in print, with simultaneous delivery of evidence to federal authorities. Saturday evening, they gathered at Catherine's house one final time. Randall sat with his sister, holding her hand, finding courage in her steady presence. Vernon paced by the window, watching the street for any sign of trouble. Louise and Tarrin sat together on the couch, the weight of everything they'd uncovered pressing down on them. "Whatever happens after tomorrow," Louise said quietly, "at least Marcus's death will matter. At least people will know he was right." Tarrin nodded, thinking about James's journal entry, about legacy, about the difference one person could make by refusing to look away. "They'll all matter now. All the men who died, all the people who tried to speak up and were silenced. Their names will be remembered." Catherine brought coffee and they sat together as darkness fell, talking in low voices about what morning might bring. Pamela had promised to call as soon as the article went live, around 6 a.m. After that, events would move quickly. Media pickup, official responses, probably chaos. Tarrin couldn't sleep. She lay in the guest room at Catherine's house, James's journal on the nightstand beside her. At some point past midnight, she picked it up and read through the last entries again, memorizing his words, his voice, the essence of who he'd been. The final page held something she hadn't noticed before. A brief note, written in different ink as if added at the last minute. "To whoever finds this, thank you for caring. Thank you for not letting the silence continue. You're braver than I was, stronger than you know. Finish this. Make their deaths mean something. And know that somewhere, in whatever comes after, I'm grateful. J.C." Tarrin traced the letters with her finger, tears sliding down her face. He'd known someone would come, had believed in it enough to leave this message of thanks and encouragement. "I found it," she whispered into the darkness. "And I'm finishing it tomorrow." Dawn came cold and clear. By 5:30 they were all awake, gathered in Catherine's kitchen with coffee and the anxious energy of people about to cross a threshold they couldn't return from. At 6:03, Pamela called. "It's live. The article just posted online. Print copies hit newsstands in an hour. The FBI received the evidence package 20 minutes ago, and the Attorney General's office is being briefed as we speak." Tarrin felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "What happens now?" "Now we watch Breslin's world fall apart. I've already had 3 calls from other journalists wanting to follow up. This is going to be national news by noon." Pamela paused. "Are you all somewhere safe?" "We're together. We'll be careful." "Good. I'll keep you updated. And Tarrin, you did the right thing. All of you did." After the call ended, Vernon pulled up the article on his laptop. They gathered around the screen, reading Pamela's careful, damning prose. Senator Breslin, implicated in decades-long cover-up of mining deaths, State investigator threatened, whistleblower killed, families denied justice. The article laid out everything: the Blackridge collapse, the falsified safety reports, Breslin's campaign contributions from Cordell Mining, the recorded phone call where he ordered evidence suppressed, Rendell Price's testimony, James Cooper's investigation and mysterious death. It named names, provided documentation, left no room for ambiguity. She did it, Louise breathed. She really did it. They spent the morning monitoring news coverage. By 8, major networks had picked up the story. By 9, the State Attorney General's office announced a formal investigation. By 10, protesters were gathering outside Breslin's office in the capital, holding signs demanding his resignation. At 11, Breslin held a press conference. They watched on Vernon's laptop as the elderly senator stood at a podium, his face drawn. His usual confidence cracked. "These allegations are false and politically motivated," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've served this state for 35 years with integrity and—" A reporter cut him off. "Senator, how do you explain the recorded phone call where you threaten a state investigator?" Breslin's jaw tightened. "That recording has not been authenticated. It could easily be fabricated in this age of digital manipulation." Another reporter: "What about the documents showing campaign contributions from Cordell Mining? Are those fabricated too? I've received donations from many businesses. That's standard political practice and in no way indicates—" "Senator, the families of the men who died at Blackridge are calling for criminal charges. Do you have anything to say to them?" For a moment, Breslin's carefully maintained composure slipped. Something ugly flickered across his face. Fear, rage, the look of a powerful man realizing his power was evaporating. Then he stepped back from the podium without answering and left the room, ignoring the shouted questions that followed him. "He knows it's over," Randall said quietly. "He knows there's no way out." By noon, 2 other senators called for Breslin's resignation. By 1, the FBI announced they were opening a criminal investigation into public corruption and obstruction of justice. By 2, Breslin's office released a statement saying he would not seek re-election and was taking a leave of absence for health reasons. "Not good enough," Vernon said. "He needs to face charges. He needs to go to prison." "He will," Tarrin said. "The FBI doesn't make announcements like that unless they're confident they have a case. And we gave them everything they need." The rest of the day brought a flood of responses, families of other miners coming forward with stories of covered-up accidents, former Cordell Mining employees offering to testify about safety violations, politicians scrambling to distance themselves from Breslin. The story had broken open a scandal far larger than just one senator and one mining company. As evening fell, Tarrin stood on Catherine's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Vernon joined her, leaning against the railing. "James would be proud of you," he said. "Of all of us. I think he knew someone would do this eventually," Tarrin replied. "He had faith that the truth was stronger than the people trying to hide it. Do you think you'll go back to the mountains, now that it's done?" Tarrin considered the question. 20 years ago, she'd fled to the mountains to escape pain she couldn't process. But standing here now, having seen the truth finally emerge, having been part of something larger than her own grief, she realized she didn't want to hide anymore. "No," she said. "I think I'm done hiding. There's too much to do down here, families to support, legal proceedings to follow, a story to keep telling until everyone responsible faces consequences." She paused. "James spent his last years fighting for justice. I think I'd like to spend my next years doing the same." Vernon smiled. "He'd like that." Inside, Louise was on the phone with a lawyer representing several families from Blackridge. Randall sat with Catherine, looking lighter than he had in decades. The weight of 20 years of silence finally lifted. They'd all been broken by the same conspiracy, all silenced in different ways, but they'd found their voices again. And tomorrow, and all the days after, they'd keep speaking until justice was finally done. Tarrin pulled James's watch from her pocket, the broken timepiece from Eagle's Point, stopped forever at the moment of his death. She held it in her palm, feeling its weight, its history, its meaning. "Thank you," she said softly, speaking to James across the distance of 20 years. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for believing someone would finish what you started. I promise I'll keep going until it's really done. Until everyone knows your name and what you died for." The mountains stood silent against the darkening sky, holding their secrets, as they always had. But this secret, this truth, was secret no longer. The light was shining in at last. 3 weeks passed before Tarrin returned to Blackridge. The media storm had subsided somewhat, though investigations were still ongoing. The FBI had filed formal charges against Senator Breslin: obstruction of justice, conspiracy, corruption. His trial was scheduled for the following year, and prosecutors were confident of conviction. Cordell Mining had ceased operations, facing lawsuits from dozens of families. Several executives were under investigation. The state legislature had passed emergency mining safety reforms, naming them the Cooper-Kenton Safety Act in honor of James and Marcus. Vernon drove Tarrin and Louise to Blackridge on a clear November morning. They'd planned a memorial service for the men who died, not just Marcus, Vincent, and Leo, but all the miners whose deaths had been covered up over the decades. Families had traveled from across the state to attend. The service was held in the old town square, such as it was, a patch of cleared ground near the abandoned mining office. Someone had erected a simple wooden platform, and folding chairs were arranged in rows. Nearly 100 people gathered despite the cold, their breath misting in the morning air. Phoebe had come from Ridgeline, bringing flowers she placed at a makeshift memorial. Catherine and Randall stood together, his first public appearance since going into hiding 20 years earlier. Former miners, now elderly, had driven hours to bear witness. Louise spoke first, her voice steady as she talked about Marcus, not just about his death, but about his life, his principles, his courage in speaking up even when it cost him everything. Vernon spoke next, his voice breaking as he apologized to the families for his silence, for the role he'd played in allowing the company to continue its dangerous practices. Several people in the crowd reached out to touch his shoulder as he stepped down, offering forgiveness he'd never thought he'd receive. Then it was Tarrin's turn. She stood at the simple podium, holding James's journal, and looked out at the gathered faces. People bound together by loss, by injustice, by the long wait for truth. James Cooper was a quiet man, she began. He didn't seek attention or praise. He just wanted to do the right thing. When he saw friends die because someone chose profit over safety, he couldn't look away. He spent years gathering evidence, building a case, trying to ensure that justice would eventually be served. She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. He died for that work, died at a place called Eagle's Point, meeting what he thought was an ally, but was actually a trap. And for 20 years, I thought his death was meaningless. I thought he'd thrown away our future for nothing. The crowd was completely silent, listening, but I was wrong. His death wasn't meaningless. The evidence he gathered, the case he built, it survived. And because of his courage, because he refused to stay silent, justice is finally being done. Senator Breslin will face trial. Cordell Mining has shut down. New safety laws will protect workers. And most importantly, the men who died are finally being remembered as they should be, as people who mattered, whose lives had value, whose deaths were not acceptable costs of doing business. She held up the journal. James wrote that he hoped someone would finish what he started. Someone braver, stronger, more determined. But the truth is, we're all just ordinary people trying to do the right thing. Marcus, Vincent, Leo, James, they were ordinary people too. They just refused to look away when others would have. That's the only difference between courage and cowardice. The willingness to act even when it's dangerous, even when it's costly. Tarrin's voice grew stronger. These men, all of them, they changed things by refusing to accept that this is just how the world works. And because of them, because of their sacrifice, the world is a little bit better, a little bit safer, a little bit more just. That's legacy. That's what matters. When she finished, the crowd rose in spontaneous applause. Tarrin stepped down, her eyes wet with tears, and Louise embraced her. They stood together as others came forward to place flowers at the memorial, to speak names that hadn't been spoken in decades. to finally grieve publicly what they'd carried privately for so long. After the service, Tarrin walked alone to the old mining office. She'd brought something with her, a small brass compass she'd found in the storage unit among James's belongings. It was old, well used, with an inscription on the back, "True North, follow what's right, always." Jay. She stood in the doorway of the office where she'd first started piecing together James's investigation, holding the compass in her palm. The needle pointed steadily north, unwavering. James had followed his true north, even knowing where it might lead. And in doing so, he'd left a trail for others to follow. Tarrin made a decision then. She wouldn't return to the mountains, wouldn't retreat back into isolation. Instead, she'd stay in Ridgeline, help the families navigate the legal proceedings, work with organizations advocating for worker safety. She'd speak at hearings, give interviews, keep telling the story until everyone responsible was held accountable. Louise had made a similar decision. She was moving back to town, opening her home to families who needed support, working with lawyers pro bono to assist with lawsuits. 26 years of isolation had ended. She was ready to live again. Vernon had started writing a book, a comprehensive account of the Blackridge tragedy and its aftermath. He wanted future generations to know what had happened, to understand the cost of choosing profit over people. As for Randall, he'd agreed to serve as a consultant for the new State Mining Safety Commission. His experience, hard-won through years of guilt and hiding, would help ensure the reforms actually protected people rather than just looking good on paper. Tarrin walked back to Vernon's truck, where he and Louise waited. As they drove out of Blackridge, she looked back at the town one last time. It was still largely abandoned, still marked by the tragedy that had occurred there. But now it was also a memorial, a reminder, a lesson. She pulled out the compass again, watching the needle hold steady. True north, the direction of what was right, not what was easy. James had shown her that path, and she'd follow it for the rest of her life. Where to now? Vernon asked. Ridgeline, Tarrin said. I need to find a place to live. Start figuring out what comes next. What does come next? Louise asked. Tarrin smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in 20 years. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. And we'll face it in the light, not hiding in the shadows. The truck rolled down the highway, carrying them back toward town, toward community, toward the messy, complicated, beautiful work of living in the world and trying to make it better. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanged. But the people who moved through those mountains, they had changed. They'd been broken and had found ways to heal. They'd been silenced and had found their voices again. Some losses never heal completely, Tarrin thought. They just learned to coexist with joy, with purpose, with meaning. She'd lost James 20 years ago. But in the storage unit with its rusted door, in the journal with its careful entries, in the evidence he'd preserved and the trail he'd left, she'd found him again. Not the man himself, but his legacy. His truth, his courage, and that, she realized, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The compass in her hand pointed north, and she followed it toward whatever came next, carrying James's memory and his mission forward into all her remaining days.